Welcome to this webinar. I'm Enrico Guarini, faculty member at the University of Milano Bicocca, and I will be hosting today's event. We thank you for taking time at your busy schedule to participate. This educational webinar is entitled Management Governance of Research Infrastructures. Today, you will be hearing from our guest speaker, Dr. Ivan Baines, Chief Operating Officer at Max Planck Institute of Molecular Cell Biology and Genetics in Dresden, Germany. This webinar is part of the Executive Masters in Management of Research Infrastructures, a new executive education program of the University of Milano Bicocca, and is also part of RI Train, an EU-funded H2020 research project. Let me show you the agenda of today. It includes a Q&A session in which our guest speaker will answer some questions emerged from the class of the masters around the topic of governance and organizations. The attendees to this webinar are the executive masters participants. I would ask you to use the Q&A feature available on your screen to submit questions to our guest speakers. And to request to speak, click the raise hand icon that appears next to your name, and I will give you this to speak. Once you have answered, please remember to lower your hand, but just click again on the icon. If you have any question, use the Q&A box. This webinar will be recorded, so you will be watch it later. And for those of you who are on Twitter, please tweet about the webinar using #Emory and #RITrain. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Ivan is, first of all, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Now, Ivan is visiting professor at University of Milano Bicocca, and is also a visiting faculty in our executive masters. As you can see from his curriculum, Ivan has a long experience of setting up and working with the research infrastructure. Before being executive director of chief operating officer at Max Planck, he had been consulting also in public sector and private sector as well, and now he's acting as chief operating officer at Max Planck Institute in Dresden. So it's my great pleasure to give the floors to Ivan. Thank you again for sharing your time and knowledge with us. Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Enrico. So firstly, I will actually try and stick to the questions as much as I can, probably straying from the questions like a politician only when I don't know the answer. So that probably is how you can tell when I'm less sure. The first question is, what is the approach for identifying, scoping the different areas of responsibility for the different structures? And I will sort of pick up more or less where my webinar, I believe you've all seen the webinar that was recorded on this subject. So in that I mentioned that the type of governance structures that you would establish may be, for example, a supervisory board. Well, let's start at the highest level, a board of directors, then a supervisory board, a scientific advisory board, and there can be user committees. I think, as I stressed in the interview, the most important consideration is representation. So everybody should feel reassured that their voice is represented in the governance structure. So, so that they can pass on an opinion and that opinion would be heard. They don't necessarily feel that they need to have a vote with regard to making a decision, but they feel very strongly that their opinion should at least be able to be voiced by someone representing their institution's interests. Now, just considering the different roles of the different types of body, the scientific advisory board, starting on that, is more technical and is providing advice to remain state of the art. So it's very much focused on the purpose of the RI and making sure that that's performed at the highest standard. A supervisory board is to ensure that the the management and operations of the RI are conducted in the appropriate fashion, and that it's operated in the efficient and compliant manner. The board is typically composed of stakeholders who are funding or investing in the RI, and they're more interested in adherence to budget, long-term sustainability, and whether or not the RI is meeting its target requirements. I think the added comment I'd like to make is that given, and this is mentioned, the complexity of, or sort of complex ecosystem, where you have RIs that are composed of many different legal entities, many different institutions, possibly even individual members, how on earth do you get a governance structure? Well, one of the things which is essential is to define the mandate of each governance body up front, and to clear that with regard to the host institutions. So if you like, you've got the reason these types of RIs are the hardest of all to manage, to finance, and to so on, for more or less any management or operational issue, is because there are conflicts which are part of the nature of what it's trying to what it in fact is trying to do. For example, the host institution providing some of the RI may be a major user and may wish to ensure prioritize access to its own internal staff members. On the other hand, the overarching body, it could be an ERIC, if that's the legal form, wants to ensure equal or reasonable access from all users of the RI in a pan-RI sense. So how do you address that? And well, one way you can do it, and you may have come across this, it's often put forward as a 50-50 rule, that 50% of the infrastructure provided by a host can be for its internal members, but if it participates in a pan-European or a larger network infrastructure, then it has to establish 50% additional capacity, or 50% of the total capacity should be available to other users. What's critical is that the rules are fair and transparent and are easily understood, and are actionable. So I think that that's probably the answer I'd provide here, and a key consideration is to clear the mandates up front and to make sure that if a particular host institution is providing a representative in the supervisory body or board, that that host institution has provided their representative a mandate, and it's understood within the host institution that that's a certain commitment that then goes beyond. They have to, if you like, honor something that may on occasion conflict with their own internal operations. The second question is, do you think that RI should have a flexible structure to adapt to rapidly changing environment? Of course, ideally, yes. Any RI would be strengthened by being able to react or adapt flexibly to a given situation. Having said that, in a practical sense, is simply not possible. And why is it not possible? It's because how essential it is to make sure that the access rules and the means and the operation of the RI is transparent and understood by everybody. If it's changing flexibly in whatever form or fashion, it's no longer fully understood exactly what it's supposed to do, who it's doing it for, and confidence in its operation. So basically, flexibility typically is research, where one can change direction on one's own discretion in 5 minutes. With regard to service and research infrastructure, it's actually very important to be consistent, reproducible, and predictable and transparent. So if you are flexible and you change the nature of the RI, what about the person who's doing a series of experiments and started a few weeks ago, and then suddenly the configuration or the model has changed? So in fact, flexibility is of course an advantage, but it's a luxury that generally is hard to accommodate for an RI. To the extent that it can be accommodated, of course it should be accommodated. The third question here is, what about equality or inequality among stakeholders, pointing out that not all stakeholders are equal. And yes, this is an issue. I think ideally, of course, you want to achieve consensus in the governance with regard to decision making anyway. If you achieve consensus, then inequality is less important. Of course, consensus is rarely is very hard to achieve, and with the more complex RIs, very rare. So there, one really has to come up with some kind of formula for how you get fair and proportional representation. And, you know, and that's really something for the General Assembly, if you have an ERIC, or, you know, some body that is representing the largest majority of users, to decide collectively whether, irrespective of the size of the contribution or the capacity that people are taking, whether everybody has one vote, or whether that vote is increased in proportion to the capacity that they use, or the investment that they make into the RI. And I think those actually are harder, even though it's clearly a reasonable thing to do. It undermines the collegiality of the interaction in those bodies. And so in many ways, a simple one party, one vote formula can work best. So balancing the side effects of contrasting decisions between stakeholders. Yes, so do you have experience of situations where unity of purpose between stakeholders could not be finally achieved, and the decision provides dissatisfaction for a significant part of the community? And absolutely, yes, I have quite some experience, both of encountering such situations and also being asked to arbitrate to resolve such differences. It's all part of coming up with a common agenda for what one wishes to do, and upfront, before the process starts, agreeing that what are the respective parties' rights to veto or not agree. That kind of defines the boundary conditions. Then one has to think, okay, in the common agenda, if we can only accommodate, if certain things are mutually exclusive between two key stakeholders, one has to think, to what extent does one need to accommodate this agenda, and to what extent does one need to accommodate the other agenda? So is it, for example, 70% of this party's agenda or this community's agenda needs to be represented on the common agenda, otherwise one simply wouldn't achieve buy-in? In other words, one has to be extremely pragmatic. What are the demands of each respective stakeholder? What influence should those demands impose on the structure and governance of that RI? And therefore, what weighting should one give their input to the common agenda? And then so that's the best you can do. And at the end, you're presenting a common agenda, at least where everybody sees that their opinion has been heard, and hopefully they see enough of their own agenda or concerns represented in the common agenda to buy in. If they can't, of course, you may have to end up splitting or providing some kind of structure, organizational structure, which creates the least disturbance or conflict within the overall operation of the RI. So if, for example, let's say it's a computing infrastructure, a computational infrastructure mainly for users, and then there's a community which is being asked to use it also for archiving and storage, and those are putting different constraints on the hardware. This is not my area at all. I'm just trying to provide an example that those are very, very different agendas. On the other hand, there are whole areas on which they're aligned. So if one can define at least where they're aligned and where they overlap and where they're different, then one can work out how to design a governance structure that provides common governance for the shared parts and independent governance for the separate parts. And if you like, that's also the same principle with a RI which is distributed and is composed of multiple institutions and multiple legal entities. It has to be worked out exactly what decisions or or rules are going to impact just the host and should be made at the level of the host, and what impact the entire RI and have to be made at the level of the supervisory body or the pan governance structure. Stakeholder consultation. Yes, so in my perspective, a sound consultative process considering all relevant stakeholders is also very important with regard to the national RI roadmap process. Absolutely. An example is I've used Euro by imaging before since I was in the project management committee, but a part of that was also at the German national level to try and get German bioimaging on the German national roadmap for funding. And I think that the community effort was extremely well done. German bioimaging had a grant from the DFG to establish itself and to establish its own governance, brought in all of the key stakeholders, did an outstanding job at really coming up with a common agenda and getting buy-in from the entire community. I think that here, one area where we did less well is we didn't engage with one of the key stakeholders from the beginning, which was the funder. Ultimately, this is going to be an 80 or 90 million euro proposal that is going to be dropped on the doorstep of the Federal Finance Ministry or Ministry for Education and Research. There are no political bodies who can simply receive an 80 or 90 million euro funding proposal without knowing about it, landing on their doorstep without being very, very concerned or upset, if you like. So making sure one remembers not just to include the users or those parts of the community that are engaged through the purpose, but also to engage those who are interested in the intent, i.e. the funders, politicians, and ministries from the beginning in the consultative process. So include all stakeholders. Moving on to number 2, MPG, best science versus RI's best service.
Ivan, do you want to leave floor some question?
Oh, absolutely. So we can, yes, we can stop after each sort of set of questions for, actually would be much preferable.
Yes, because I see there is one booked questions from Michela Vellico. So please, Michela, you can speak.
Yeah.
Please would say the name of research infrastructure where you work.
Yeah, what?
You can speak, Michela.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay,
yes.
Sorry, maybe it's okay. I didn't book the question. Maybe
no
it's something. Okay, it was something wrong with my mouse. Sorry. Well, in any case, my research infrastructure is Excel. Excel is has been recently approved as an ERIC. And well, I found very interesting the last point Professor Ivan Baines mentioned. So to include also the government and other political bodies in decisions. So it's a very worthy experience. Also, by Excel point of view, for example, it was necessary to include the government and national bodies in the consultation before applying to become an ERIC. So thank you for your clear explanation.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, for that good example of when it makes a difference.
Any other questions from participants? I see Tiago. You can speak, Tiago, please.
Yeah. Hi, from CCMR, Tiago. And what if the stakeholders, we want them to participate, but they don't want to? And that happens even with the government. Sometimes, we want them to come and they are even included sometimes in the meetings, but then they never appear. How do you deal with that? Which is a little bit the opposite that sometimes we discuss.
Well, at least they can't get so upset because at least they've been invited to the party. So if they don't show up to the party, that's nothing you can do about that. but how can you incentivize them to take a stronger interest? I think it's very important to address their agenda or their interest, i.e. the intent. Is it to find a more cost-effective structure for providing access to an essential RI? Is it that they wish to nurture the transfer of responsibility for running an RI from a governmental office to the user community? So to address their interests and their intent, then to say, how would you like to monitor our efforts to accommodate that? Would you like us to come to the ministry and provide a presentation report on a half-yearly basis? Would you like to have a person who's a passive observer in those meetings? So you try and ask them, how would they like to ensure that their interests are represented in establishing that agenda? If you like, you tie them in to becoming a stronger stakeholder by virtue of, I mean, if you ask the question, what is your intent? What is your agenda here? They must provide some answer. You can also provide very strong financial arguments or justification, and actually illustrate the enormous benefit to the funder or to the government of having coordinated, non-redundant financing of RI. So it's not done for each institution on an institution or city by city basis, but it's instead done in a synchronized and coordinated way, and one can very easily illustrate the cost benefits to the government. So basically, it's a combination of providing compelling arguments and tying them into the process by representation and asking them what their agenda is and how they would wish to have that represented. And I think that will generally be successful. But yes, Tiago, it's a frustration when you when you know that it's essential, well, very important for the government or politicians to engage, and they don't want to, and often it may be the wrong period of the political cycle or whatever else, and they're focused on other things. So you can have something completely come out of sort of left field. For example, in the middle of our discussions, we were suddenly told that everyone was busy dealing with the immigration crisis, and so they didn't have time to think about national infrastructure for research. So all sorts of things can happen.
If I don't see any other questions from participants, I think we can move to the next topics, governance of science service provision. Okay, so the next question is really asking about the, whether, so the mandate of the Max Planck is to do the best science in principle, and every group leader has a large amount of independence. And the question is this compatible with the role of RIs, whose mandate is to provide the best service? And I would say no, it's not. The nature of research and service are very different, and I think that Francisco was also pointing the question in that direction to underscore that in fact a service provider is a more humble role. It's dedicating oneself or the RI's purpose to support others, and to support their agenda, their research plans and vision. So independence per se, it's really what you really want to do is create a dynamic between the user and the provider, i.e. why would the provider of a service cater to the specific needs of a user if it's on a non-economic basis? As you know, ERICs are required to be on a non-economic basis, i.e. they're not for profit, they're for the benefit of the community. If it's for the benefit, what is driving, if it's not profit and getting more income, why is the RI service provider, should it feel passionately about satisfying the user? And creating dynamics between the two, an umbilical link, if you like, is actually very important. One of the ways in which that can be done, which I'm very keen on, even though it's hard to implement on a pan-European level, just let's say
part of the financing of an RI long term is through user fees. If those user fees are to be paid directly by the user, by the individual scientist, it's very hard to get traction. But they're always, the intuition is always to do it within their own resources in their local institution. So there's less incentive to an individual user. Of course, they may be highly incentivized to access a given instrument that they couldn't otherwise access. But I think key to this is actually getting a commitment at the institutional level. So rather than discussing with every user individually, you can get a sort of subscription from the institute to provide a certain capacity, which it can then provide to its users. So if you like, you can provide a very strong incentivization. The institute has an interest in its scientists using the latest state of the art and doing top-level research. Therefore, it has a retainer relationship with the RI, provides a certain capacity, which it splits up and provides to its group leaders or its research laboratories, however it wishes to do it. So they are actually, it's an internal virtual financing, and the institute is actually paying the bills. So that highly incentivizes the user. So you can think of ways of, if you like, it's a sort of subsidy, but it's really a subsidy by providing the right structure with the right stakeholder. And I think it would be difficult to provide more clarity with how that can work on an individual basis without spending a lot more time. But I think that's the key point. But the answer to the question is they're very different, and providing the best service is, and they should be evaluated and assessed by different criteria that should reflect the different nature of what they're trying to do. So, so that they're both, that's the key element. If both continuation and promotion are evaluated by a set of criteria, and those criteria are focused on service, in the case of a service provider and on research, that makes a distinction. How can you protect the governance of an RI if you have individuals in the governance structure and as key users? Now, I feel that this is actually, if the question is that the governance, you have a major heavy user actually on the board of, on the supervisory board of an RI, that's completely inappropriate, because yes, they will throw around their weight with regard to their own interests and their own agenda. Such individuals absolutely should be heard and their voice is extremely important, but they should be on the scientific advisory board or in the user committees. They should not be in the supervisory board, because the supervisory board is building a conflict into the governance structure. But on the other hand, if their voice is heard as part of the scientific advisory governance or user feedback, then it's absolutely appropriate. If you do have such a heavy user in the board, how can one adjust or sort of, I think, only by direct discussion with the board and its other members with that key user present, saying, you are perhaps the most important user, but collectively the smaller users are actually a majority of the capacity, and their agenda is a bit different. How do we accommodate that and do it in a way which is not sort of challenging the key users' interests, but rather including them in a discussion of how to best serve the others would be, I think, the better strategy. So it's mentioned here that in my interview I said that some RIs could provide the service themselves, but for smaller partners it's indispensable. Now, for those larger partners that could provide the service themselves, what's the incentive? What's the added value? And I think the short answer there is that basically a professionally run and with a larger number of stakeholders, hopefully a more robust model should be more sustainable, more predictive, provide a richer landscape of opportunity, and be much easier for the host for a large user institution to anticipate how to access it than to build it themselves. And perhaps most importantly, it's dealing with the one-off costs. So even for a very large user, to replace all of the infrastructure of an RI, of the actual equipment and so on a 3 to 5 year cycle is extremely difficult. It has this massive blip of spending of which may be in tens of millions every 3 to 5 years, and that is disappears because then it's in the context of a consortium. So it also much better accommodates variable demand from within their own institution. So if they do it themselves, they have to maintain a capacity which represents the peak demand, perhaps at peak period, if they need to accommodate that, and so it'll be underutilized at other times. So there are many benefits, actually. So that's the number 2. We could take a few questions there.
Yes, we have one question from Marcus Pasterk. Please, Marcus, you're allowed to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian, for the answers to the questions so far. Maybe one additional point on the question on conflict of interest. I think it is also important to have the composition and duties of the individual governance bodies precisely written down, so that such potential conflicts actually can't appear. In BBMRI, we actually had such a conflict where a person who was nominated by the government to be the national coordinator, as well as the representative in the supervisory body. So it was on the one hand advising the Director General, and then on the other hand supervising the Director General. Now, if governments decide to do so, there is little influence, direct influence. Of course, you can talk back to the governments to change it. But the clearer the composition and the duties are laid down in, statutes, bylaws, or whatever, the easier it is in such conflict of interest situations to actually find a solution.
Excellent, Marcus. Thank you so much. I mentioned the importance of defining those mandates for the different bodies, and so I completely agree with you that it's essential. And if you do it well, you can avoid a lot. But that was a very nice example. Thanks a lot. So, Enrico, should we go on to the third set of questions, the shared values, service standards, and incentives in distributed RIs?
Please, go ahead.
So the first question, how to balance interest between nationally oriented host institutions and the pan-European user community. I mentioned this earlier, there's the so-called sort of 50-50 rule. It could be 30-70, so that where you put the divide. I think, again, what's important is it should be clearly defined and transparent. So what is the total capacity? What is available on a equal access basis from all users. And a number of the national infrastructures which have then participated in pan-European SREs have used this 50-50 rule, where in order to receive funding from the national on the national roadmap on the national level, they've had to make sure that at least 50% of the new capacity, or in some cases the total capacity, is made available on a completely first come first serve basis, or at least on some transparent set of access rules that are equal for everybody. So I think that can be done, and I personally prefer, for example, in Dresden, all of our RIs are basically fully openly accessible to all, and there is no prioritization of internal users. It's simply a growth model. So if more is demanded, then we have an ability to increase capacity. So in principle, we should always be able to accommodate whatever user is interested. how to incentivize buy-in of the participating institutions. I think I've really answered most of this question, I hope. The question is, you have emphasized the necessity to reach the buy-in of the community in order to lead research infrastructures to a success. At the same time, next to the community in the broader sense, distributed RI is required to achieve a buy-in and strong commitment of participating institutions, platforms, infrastructures. So I think here it's extremely excuse me, it's extremely important to not forget about the institution. I think we do that very frequently. We reach out to the user, and there's a European imaging community, there's a European biobanking, there's a European clinical trials, climate control, every different area, and they reach out to their respective community, who are basically the scientists. In fact, it's extremely important to approach the institutes themselves and to have a discussion. Well, you know, what is your mandate? What are the challenges you have over the next period to remain state of the art? This is how we can help you. The best model for us to do that is to have some predictable and sustainable relationship. For example, you pay a retainer or a subscription to our RRI, which allows you to provide it to your scientists on a preferred basis, and there's no more cost-effective way of doing it. If you can present that argument, then generally the institute is actually more able to make a commitment than the individual users or PIs. So I think this is something which is often overlooked, and if you incentivize the institute, then the institute can incentivize its scientists. Service standards, commitments, and incentives in distributed RIs. How to maximize the involvement and commitment of the national institutions and providing the service at the nodes to make sure that the service provision is done as per the RI standard. Well, we all know sort of about the ISO certifications. There are means of providing certifications, of achieving a particular quality standard. Within RIs, it's generally better done as benchmarking within a given community, so that the community defines the quality standards within their own community, and that are then required to be met by the RI. And it can be that you need to achieve those particular quality criteria before you get the logo of being a BBMRI provider or a Elixir provider or whatever. Before you can get that logo of excellence, you need to show that you have implemented the quality control standards that have been agreed upon by the community. How to create incentives for scientists to get involved in service. Well, if they're employed to provide a service, that's not usually too much of a problem. If on the other side, on the other hand, the scientists also have a combined research mandate, then they have an inherent conflict, because if they are mandated to do research, and if they're evaluated according to papers and impact factor and the normal things, then they're anxious every time they're not pursuing that goal. So that is actually one of the reasons I'm so critical of this mixed hybrid of a research group or leading PI in a particular technology area, providing that technology as a service on the side, or even running facility. It's an inbuilt conflict, which it can work if you have a very altruistic person, but then they usually suffer on their research. They do poorly in evaluation. So it's a built-in conflict which rarely works. So I think the answer is keep it separate and have professional service providers who are of course scientists, but do not have a research mandate. Need of powers of persuasion for the buy-in of users. Is there any space for coercive actions in the management of infrastructure or RI's infrastructure? Is it all carrots and never sticks? Well, I mean, Germany, we like sticks here as well. And so carrots are certainly not all that's used. One way in which you can do it is by removing the ability of the scientists to meet their own needs within their own research institution. So Of course, this is very easy if it's very large national infrastructure, telescopes, MRIs, or whatever. If it's even imaging and microscopes, you can make a rule in an institution that that no group is permitted to purchase production instruments except to put them into the RI that provides them as being openly accessible. I think this is it sounds like a top-down draconian guideline, but in fact, people, if you do it, everyone likes it very quickly because everyone's doing it. It means that you have many more means at your disposal to keep your infrastructure state of the art, and everybody's contributing production, not custom built or self-built instruments, but production instruments into for the common good. So I think that providing those decisions at the level of individual institutes, not to resource individuals, but provide only a budget or a ability to use shared infrastructure is a good way of doing it. So that is a coercive action. The quality check of governance and or services offered in turn. In the RI organization described by Ivan, is there anybody performing a quality check of governance and or services offered? Does the RI perform a kind of self-assessment in order to guarantee a continuous improvement, or is it better if the assessment is performed externally? Absolutely essential point, and the answer is both. The RI should be continually self-assessing, and from at every level, technology getting continually challenging its technology. Is it keeping its fingers on the pulse of what's going on and remaining state of the art? What's the quality of the service that's provided? Talking to the users, getting feedback, providing web tools and so on to provide that feedback. Absolutely essential. The goal should be to excel, and then that should be evaluated on a less regular basis, but every 2 to 3 years, by an external joint advisory panel or advisory or evaluation panel composed of external members. So both are extremely important. I generally think that every RI should have, so if you have many smaller RIs, as we do here, each RI has its own executive, if you like, panel that provides advice, and then they are all collectively evaluated by one representative of each of these small panels. But the small panels are the tool of the leader of the RI, whereas the big joint advisory evaluative panel is the tool of the institute to see whether collectively the RIs are doing what they are intended to do. Okay, I'm just having a look, see how we're doing here. I think that's really the key points for number 3. So I can take questions there.
Yes, we have one question. Pavel, I see Pavel Hodzak. Yes, Pavel, you're allowed to speak.
How, Ivan? Pavel, hi. Yeah, the question to the last answer you were giving us about the evaluation. So do you have kind of a unified tool for how do you do it practically, even with the smaller RIs? So, do you have some questionnaires or?
Yes. So basically, the small panels, which are only 3-member panels, are really a tool of the individual RI, of the individual technology platform or scientific core. And how they run their evaluation is, to a large extent, to their discretion. But the composition of the panel has to have at least an internal power user, has to have an external leader from a technology perspective in the field, and the second person could be another technology expert, or could be a external person who is using the technology. So we try and get a breadth of and that 3-person panel is organized by the individual leader of the RI. Then for running the joint advisory panel, collectively, they want to see user surveys. We ask them up front what type of information. They will see all of the reports of the individual small panels. They will go into a joint panel, and then they will try and look across all of the RIs, and they will see where there's overlap, redundancies. You'll suddenly find you've got 3 RIs all doing the same kind of image analysis or tool development in algorithms or something. And so they'll make those types of comment. So it's a bit like organizing a scientific advisory board meeting. You provide a report. The report contains all of the individual small panel reports. Then you run a meeting where they come and interview both users and providers. They read the questionnaires. They go through the institute and ask people, and they see how you're equipped and resourced, and then they can advise you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So, Enrico, we're down to the 4th, research versus science management. And the managerial culture.
Ivan, we have a very short question from Tiago.
Yep.
Hi, Ivan. So I like the subscription model. And actually, on the last model, we were talking, me and Antonio were talking, that maybe there could even be a share type of, share options, not share option, but shares, where some users are represented in the board related to the shares they have, and that could be related to the subscription. But these days, institutes are short of free money, so to speak. I mean, it's all through projects, and these type of things are not eligible in the project. So do you have any trick that we could get, that money?
There has to be tricks, because as you point out, this is where it's down to, whose money it is. It's not profit driven. So who's interested is it to actually pay? So with regard to the institute, that's why I encourage this dialogue so again, if an institute assesses how much it's spending through its research groups on a particular technology, it's impossible that it can't achieve an economy of scale and a cost effectiveness by having a single subscription at the institute level. So in other words, if you're getting 100 requests and they're happening individually, and you could pool those 100 and say that's the capacity that we need to subscribe to, and then we can resell them internally, that's going to be a major saving for the institute. So in other words, it's not an added cost, it's a saving. It's a redistribution. It can't be on top of existing costs. It has to be instead of the existing costs. The existing costs are individual access, which is not cost effective at all, and it can be replaced by having a larger scale institutional subscription. But to the user, it ends up being the same, because they're a scientist in the institute, and whether it's being sold to them directly by the RI provider, or whether it's being resold by the institute, i.e. the institute subscribing and then selling or providing a capacity to the actual scientists, the actual users don't care. So it will be a saving, and so they can be persuaded. If you provide those arguments, they can be persuaded to sign on. You can then say there are further benefits. Now you have that structure established. Now, once the scientists become users from this reselling internally, you can buy a rather modest amount of capacity. And once, as we all know, once a particular research direction gains traction and is successful, the appetite increases very quickly. So once you've got users on board, they will typically want more and more capacity, and then they start paying for it with their own grants and third-party funds. And so then you have a major new stream. So just to give you examples in a couple of the institutes where I've set this up, it's been able to provide a sort of virtual budget of a few €100,000 that has nurtured the use of an external bit of RI through a institutional subscription that very quickly has turned into over €1 million of external third-party funding being run through that same process, which means that ultimately then the institute's costs are being subsidized rather than the other way around. So if it's done in this way, it's actually a significant saving at the same time of getting higher quality of opportunity. All right, so Tiago,
Move on. The last one topic.
Yep, one more topic. And research versus science management. The comment is that RI is halfway between academic and procedural organizations, and that management often comes from a scientific background, and that most of the middle management are still very much engaged in science. However, sometimes scientific staff do not always understand or appreciate the work of managers and see them more as obstacles and bureaucracy. And the question is, do scientists need to be made aware of the role and need of managers? And should all scientists be trained in some management? And how to reconcile management and science so that it does not become a choice? I think it's an incredibly important point, and this is, of course, why the Executive Masters in Management of RIs has been established. Absolutely, it's essential. Science has changed, not in all areas equally, but in many areas it's much more multidisciplinary. It requires workflows, it requires massive data management strategies and archiving. There's no question that the skills required by scientists and particularly PIs has shifted, and you can even see it now. I don't know if others have noticed this, but now in the sort of 20 years ago, the most successful scientists were often even marginally autistic in their focus, obsessive focus on their area, which was a necessity. Whereas now there are many more successful PIs who are able to manage complex multi-stakeholder projects that are multidisciplinary. And so you see more people coming through with people skills. I think it's essential to learn management skills, basic management skills now in research, in top-level research institutes. And I think that, therefore, actually, that this course is extremely well-timed. Now, it says the need for professional managers seems to be the current trend. At what stage and at what time of education do you suggest for RI senior management? Now, this is a complex one because, I mean, I think that, well, I think we've all appreciated that you have to have multidisciplinary threads in research in a lab, and that this is very complicated. How do you integrate within a single PI an ability to embrace biology, computer science, and physics, for example? Well, the same will be true for now PIs with regard, or managers of RIs. They will have to embrace business, administrative skills, and science, and that this is simply an evolution of what we need to do. So, I think one can have. It doesn't mean to say that you have to be an MD, PhD, MBA, blah blah blah. You do not need to have the same. Very high graduate qualification in each area, but I think if the principal purpose of an RA is scientific, I think actually having a graduate degree or whatever, having experience in research is very important. But you could have a bachelor's level or even lesser level of understanding of economics and administration. So I think as long as you have a feeling for each of those areas, but I think it's also possible for scientists who typically are very good at learning, that's what they spend their whole time doing, if they have the opportunity to do an internship or to join an RA in a more junior place to learn whilst doing, that's also possible. But I think some formal recognition of the skill set is going to be important, because otherwise you get people who, some people who project that they can do something who actually aren't the right people, and then you undermine the structure because you don't have the right competence. What's your opinion about mixing personal responsibilities for a research unit with duties related to a research infrastructure? So I think I've answered this question. I think it just simply is not a good idea at all, that mixing. I know this is very upsetting to many people running RIs, that they want the opportunity to do research. If one does do it, one must make sure that the research is not a free license to do mediocre research, that it's going to be evaluated by the same standards as the research group leaders are, or research labs are being evaluated. So, many RIs do research that is not evaluated by the same criteria as the research activities, and that's not really fair. So, but I think it introduces so many conflicts, it's not a good idea. Yes, so the next question. Research infrastructures are not just service, but also involve a portion of research activities, and how to find the right balance. When I gave that very strong comment, I was not really referring to method development and exploratory work to establish a new, work out how to handle a particular sample. There are lots of areas where some very focused research is appropriate. If research is going to be done at all, what's important is it's not an overhead on the provision of the service. In other words, if you decide that it's 75% service, 25% research, the 25% research should be the subject of a short proposal, nothing too burdensome, that defines exactly what resources it will require, and those resources should be separated from the finances of providing the service. Otherwise, the users are in fact funding this 25% research, which is not really fair on them because they don't have a stake in that research. If it has a technology focus or is new protocols, they can benefit from it. But it's not really fair that the user community should be sort of subsidizing or supporting research which is subject to less stringent performance requirements, for example. But it is possible, as long as you keep it clearly separated, define it and make it the subject of a proposal, and that make sure that the research part is subject to the same evaluation as research elsewhere in that organization, it can be done in an okay way. So I think those are all the questions.
Yeah, and on this issue, last issues, Ivan, I can add something, because I think that once you are managing the service provisions or research are quite different skills, and so you have to make separate and just to focus on the key value drivers of each activity. So this is important what you have said. So now I think it's time to close this webinar. I think that you have provided very interesting questions to very interesting topics raised from participants. I think we need a lot of time to answer again these questions, but we'll go on with the discussions. First of all, thank you for joining our webinar today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And this webinar has been recorded, so you can watch it later. We certainly appreciate your attendance and participation. So thank you again, Ivan, all of you, and have a wonderful continuation.
And from my side, thank you all very much as well for participating. And I would like to just echo Enrique's comments. The questions were exceptional, I think reflecting on the very high level of the participants of this course. So it would be interesting to have more opportunity for discussion. But thank you from my side.
Thank you to you, Ivan, for sharing your time and knowledge with us.